Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
In this episode, we're focusing on heifers after they've made it through that weaning transition period. I'm Kathy Barrett with Cornell's PRODAIRY program, and with me for this discussion is Dave Balbian, who is the Regional Dairy Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Central New York. And we also have Dr. Rob Lynch, who is a veterinarian and also the Herd Health Management Specialist for Cornell's PRODAIRY program. We're going to be focusing our discussion on health issues that impact your heifers that are centered around disease and growth issues. We're going to save the discussion on reproductive issues for the next episode of our podcast series. So welcome, Rob and Dave. Glad to have you join us today. Let's go ahead and get started with why you think it's important for us to be focusing on this age group of animals. Rob?
Maybe just to kick it off, we could just remind the listeners that how well you do in the heifer rearing phase of your animals will pay you back later on. To have really good producing milk cows, it starts with the calf. And this is a period in a heifer's raising where we tend to lose track of them. We can lose ground. I think the hardest part is getting them weaned. If we've been successful up to that point, boy, with just a little more management, we can get them through this next period of time. It doesn't take a lot of input.
I think what happens is that, like you said, getting them through weaning, getting them through that from birth till through weaning takes a lot of effort to really be successful and do a good job. And it's almost like a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
All right, we don't have to even think about them now.
Yep, I'll see you again when you come to the calving pen.
Right.
So, Rob and Dave, where do you start when you're troubleshooting heifer health issues on a dairy?
Well, I'll jump in, and I guess for a farm that's raising all the replacements, I take a look at those fresh first calf heifers to try to make some kind of an assessment on what kind of growth that they had, what kind of performance those animals have in the herd, and then kind of benchmark that against the rest of the herd to determine how they're stacking up. Do they have the size and scale that they need? Are they performing the way they should be performing? And if not, why not? And if that's the case, then we go back and kind of take a look at what's happening downstream, so to speak.
You know, it takes a couple of years to get the performance data that matters. You know, how well do these animals grow up and how well do they milk as adults? But that takes a few years to happen. And so what we're looking at is maybe what happened years ago. So, you know, are the current management approaches, do they match up with past management practices?
Well, that's a good point, Rob. You know, my approach there is assuming that things have been steady state for a few years.
Yeah.
Yep.
Dave, what data, what numbers are you going to be looking at?
Well, one of the things, and with a larger herd, it's a little bit easier when you look at the data, but everything else being equal, if we have enough animals, first lactation, second lactation, and then third and greater, and if our average days in milk are pretty comparable, kind of a quick and dirty way to kind of see how you're doing is to take a look at what the average daily milk production is for each of those lactation groups. And kind of a quick rule of thumb is that basically our second lactation animals should be probably about 10 pounds less than our third and greater lactation animals in their daily milk production. And our first lactation animals should be about 10 pounds less than our second. So basically a kind of a 10-pound daily milk production stepping stone, so to speak. Again, assuming that we have enough numbers in each of these groups and our average days in milk are pretty comparable. And again, with a larger herd, that's more likely to be the case. But that's kind of a first cut to kind of see how they're stacking up in productivity.
And what kind of things do you look at, Rob?
Yeah, it's hard to leave parts out. You really kind of have to check all the boxes. So we just kind of go down the list of all the different management steps that gets a heifer into the milking herd. And so we look at the diets, how feed is delivered to these groups of animals. all have adequate access to the feed when it's delivered. Housing in all the various heifer barns out there, is it adequate? Is it comfortable? Is the ventilation adequate? We look at, like Dave had mentioned, we're looking at growth metrics along the way. Are these animals actually growing to what we're formulating for, what our goals are? And then we really got to get into some of the specifics of how much disease is present. Are we losing animals, or are we having a lot of diseases to treat and losing some performance because of health reasons? And then we have a lot of protocols in place on dairies. And so these dairies ought to have some sort of herd health programs with vaccination protocols. Are those being followed? If these animals are out on pasture, what's our parasite control strategies for those heifers? Just making sure that the things that we thought were happening are actually happening.
I like to look at the fresh first calf heifers, the heifers that are coming into the milking string. Kind of a rule of thumb is that pre-fresh first calf heifers should be about 85% of mature weight for the herd. I mean, one of the things you got to make an assessment on is what's the mature weight of the cows in your herd? What kind of animals do you have? Mature weight 1,800 pounds? Is it 1,400 pounds? Of course, we're kind of all basing this on Holsteins because that's the majority of the animals that are out there. Also, what kind of body condition do they have? In other words, did they grow up with a good frame size? Did we get good skeletal development on these animals? Are they tall? Are they at the size and the age? You know, we'd like to see them calving in at 22 months of age, maybe 23, somewhere in that neighborhood at 85% of mature weight, and not over conditioned. The body condition score of maybe 3.25 plus or minus, somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know. I like to kind of look at what's happening and then kind of go backwards.
Mm-hmm. How do farmers get some of these measurements that you're talking about, Dave?
Well, I mean, one of the things they can do with their heifers and their heifer housing, and I think many of us have seen people do this, is basically put some kind of a yardstick up basically along a wall someplace so you can kind of take a look at what kind of height you've got on these animals. Obviously, if a farm has got scales and they can actually weigh animals and then take a look at their heights, it's a good way to monitor what's going on. Weigh tapes are better than nothing. They're not the most accurate, but they're better than eyeballing them. You know, some of the guidelines are at breeding age, 12 to 14 months of age, a hip height in the neighborhood of 51 inches. And at calving, a hip height of, say, 55 inches or so. Again, it's going to depend a little bit on the kind of animals you have from a standpoint of genetics or what the herd is made up of. Actually, Penn State has got some great online information that gives some guidelines and a way to kind of track heifers from younger ages on up to see if they're on target for your individual situation. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. Of course, you could put data into dairy comp. One of the things that, you know, I say you need to be working with a competent nutritionist that's using up-to-date software like CNCPS or something equivalent to formulate rations. And you need some kind of a monitoring system to track what's going on. I think we get so used to monitoring our lactating cows and using the bulk tank as kind of an indicator, or maybe milk components, really, which are better, pounds of components per cow per day. But what's our immediate feedback with heifers? When we get into different forages, we change the diets, we don't have that immediate feedback. So we got to do a better job of monitoring the performance of these animals from a standpoint of growth. You know, we can put weight on heifers pretty easily by feeding them a high energy diet, but we don't want fat, short, roly-poly beefers. We want dairy heifers. So we got to have enough metabolizable protein, crude protein in the diet to get that gain and frame size that we want.
Yeah, I just make sure the diet is dialed in to do what it's supposed to do. And then we have to do a periodic check that the animals are actually converting that feed into growth. And so, you know, maybe we're not getting weights on every single heifer on a monthly basis, but can we at least get some cohorts? Can we just do some subsampling, some strategic weights along the way, just to check the process that it's actually converting into growth? And then that way, if we start identifying some shortfalls, we found them sooner in the process, and we can more likely have some options to maybe course correct, versus at the end of the line, you've got heifers calving in that you're not happy with. You know, at that point, the damage is done. we can't undo that. So the sooner we figure out where we're losing ground, we might be able to make some corrections earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you decipher whether the health issue is due to disease incidents or nutrition or the environment?
Yeah, it's a little tricky. Sometimes it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. Are these animals unthrifty and not meeting our growth expectations because they've had some health issues, or they weren't growing very well, so they're immune suppressed and they came down with some health issues? So it's hard to really say sometimes which happened first. And we run into this often, that this is a group that doesn't get as intensely managed as, say, the milking herd. And so we often end up just not enough information on these animals. And so I usually look for and don't often find that, they're, tracking health disease incidences in a way that kind of lets us understand how well these animals are doing. At what age were these animals first sick, with what condition? Did they respond to the treatment protocol? Are they relapsing? Are we treating them multiple times? That information is really useful, particularly in the group of animals that's not giving us twice a day, 3 times a day input on how well they're doing.
We're approaching a time of the year where some of these younger animals, the ones that have been recently weaned, from an environmental standpoint, can really be hurt. If you're into nutrition and you know what CNCPS is, the computer software, you can take basically an animal that's 300 or 400 pounds, that's gaining 2 pounds a day, theoretically on a diet. You can change the environment from a standpoint of the temperature, can make this animal dirty instead of clean, wet, cold temperature, and wind, and you can change that growth rate from 2 pounds a day to 0. So the kind of environment these animals are in, especially the younger ones, can really have a big impact from a standpoint of how well they're going to grow or not grow. So it all kind of interplays together.
Dave, how often do you think the farm's nutritionist should go out and check on the heifers and evaluate them and see if there's any ration changes that need to be made?
Well, it's probably going to depend on the nutritionist, the relationship, the herd size. But I guess I would say, on some farms, the nutritionist is there every week or maybe twice a month. But probably every third time or so that the nutritionist is there, or maybe I should say maybe every month or so, the nutritionist ought to be taking a look at what's going on with those heifers. And there certainly ought to be attention paid to the forages these heifers are getting and how the diets are formulated. We don't want to have a forage change and then not re-examine or reevaluate the diet, because it may mean that we're putting on the wrong type of gain, or maybe we're not getting the gain that we should be getting. So we need to stay on top of these diets with these heifers if they're going to calve in the size and stature and weight and perform the way we want them to perform in the milking herd. So not maybe as much as the lactating cows, but I wouldn't let it slip too much.
Yeah, I mean, intake data is so helpful with these aged heifers. It's just understanding, are they eating what it is that we're offering them?
And the other thing, Rob, is that we have emphasized so much multiple feedings or pushing up feed to our lactating cows. This is an area that really lacks with some of our heifers. The feed is there, but they can't reach it. So it might as well not be there. And we need to be pushing feed up to these heifers to be sure they have access and that they can all fit at the feed bunk. I think some of the slug feeding habits that we sometimes see in our lactating cows can begin with heifers when they're fed once a day and maybe only pushed up one other time. And when the feed is there, they're hungry because they haven't had feed in a long time. And designing kind of your routine to keep that feed pushed up, even to your heifers, I think can really gain some big benefits.
Well, it's not unusual at all to kind of overdo your facilities. We've got a lot of heifers entering into these facilities that were built for smaller herds. And so, we end up not having enough places for heifers to lay down, not having enough access to the feed when it's delivered. And that's just an imbalance of what those barns were originally built for.
Yeah, and that in itself can be problematic.
Yeah.
And that you end up with animals that just are kind of the low one on the totem pole that just do not perform, do not grow. So there needs to be some adjustments from the standpoint of the facilities.
Yeah, and then it kind of brings up another area of, not everybody makes it to the big leagues. And so farms should have some set criteria of what constitutes an animal that's fitting into this program and going to make it to the milking herd, and which animals should we cut our losses on before then.
Yeah, and certainly some heifers should be culled along the ways. That's something that people should consider rather than putting more and more money into an animal that obviously is not going to perform.
Yeah, I think that's where if you have a nice set of records, it gives you that information, because we don't get a whole lot of other inputs from these non-lactating animals. Having reliable records to refer back to and see, like, well, we have a health history on some of these calves, we've got poor growth on some of these calves, and I think it just makes for a more informed decision on who stays and who goes.
Along those lines, Rob, what are the most common diseases that you see in this age group of heifers?
Once we get these animals weaned, we're a little bit out of the woods. Hopefully we have very little disease going forward, but it's 60% of the time when we lose heifers after weaning, it's probably related to pneumonia. And so we look at pneumonia incidents through the various barns or age pens. We do see a little diarrhea from time to time in these heifers as well. And then there's some infectious hoof disease that may get into the heifer barns that we might want to make sure we have things in place to deal with that. And then we just kind of keep an eye out for those odd things that crop up. But we will lose animals occasionally, and it's nice to capitalize on an opportunity to get a good necropsy done, just on the off chance that something weird does crop up.
Rob, you mentioned pneumonia, and oftentimes it's related to lack of ventilation or poor ventilation. Even in the cold weather, sometimes people feel that they have to shut everything up to keep the heat in there. And it's nice to keep a little higher temperature in the really extreme cold, especially for our younger heifers. But we still need ventilation. The guidelines per animal for these heifers that are, say, 2 to 6 months of age is 20 CFM in cold weather, 60 in mild, and 130 in hot weather. So even under the coldest conditions, we got to get some fresh air in there and get that stale, contaminated air out of there. And if we keep them clean and dry and feed them right, they're going to be fine. But we close everything right up and we have that stinky, stale air. It's just a recipe for disaster.
And these little calves, they don't generate the heat to really make natural ventilation work well. So we do need some mechanical assistance in these younger calf pens.
Yeah. And again, as I said, when it's really cold, they got to be clean and dry. And we got to be sure that they're well fed, and they'll be okay.
So how about when heifers are out on pasture?
A lot of the same things, and maybe a couple of caveats. Access to feed. We got to make sure that the pasture is providing the part of the diet that it's designed to provide. And then if we're supplementing, that's a lot like what we think of when it comes to a feed bunk. Can they get to wherever the supplements are being offered? And can everybody get to them adequately? When they're outdoors, it gets hot, it gets miserable, it gets really cold, it can get really muddy. And so we just have to make sure that the conditions outside don't get so difficult for the heifers that it starts to impact their performance. And then fly control, we deal with flies indoors, we deal with flies outdoors. So make sure that whatever the pest program is, that it's actually getting done.
I would agree. I'd say just beware of drought situations. We had some dry weather this last year. Depending on your stocking rate, there's not enough feed there. There's going to need to be some additional supplementation. Be sure they got water and shade. Sometimes people say, well, it's cheap to put them out on pasture, but if you're not monitoring them and they're not growing, it's going to take a lot longer for them to reach the size, or they're going to end up being undersized. You need to pay attention, kind of keep track of how they're doing. And if they're not doing well, they need some extra attention, some extra groceries, so to speak.
It can really impact their resistance of disease. Once they get into that poor plane of nutrition, some of the luxuries like the immune system starts to get set aside just to stay alive. And so if we see a disease increase when the groceries run short.
One of the things people should do if they haven't accessed it already is get on the internet and take a look at the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association gold standards. Just do a Google search for that. You'll find a tremendous amount of information from a standpoint of health, housing, nutrition, you name it. Gives you all kinds of great information. And you're going to do a good job with these heifers, and you're going to have productive animals entering the milking string. Got to have healthy, well-grown heifers. In the time that we have here, it's pretty limited. Go ahead and look for some of those resources. Get into the details. Work with your nutritionist to come up with a plan so that you're getting the kind of results that you want.
And that's good advice for us to end on, Dave. Thank you both, Rob and Dave, for an excellent discussion on troubleshooting health issues with your weaned heifers. I want to remind folks that our next episode, we will be focusing on troubleshooting issues with your heifer reproductive program with Dr. Julio Giordano, who is a faculty member at Cornell University. Thanks for listening, and thanks once again to Rob and Dave for an excellent discussion.
Thanks, Kathy. It was a lot of fun. Good talking to you, Dave.
Yes, thank you both. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this Herd Health Troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the PRODAIRY website, along with many other resources.